Hi, welcome to my Parsha Shir. Today's Shir for Parshas Noach is sponsored by David and Marnie Nagel in memory of David's father, Jack Nagel, Yaakov Elimelech ben Avram Abba Zichron Livrocha, whose yahrzeit is on the 3rd of Cheshvan. Jack was such a wonderful man, a Holocaust survivor who built a beautiful family here in Los Angeles, and it's now spread out far and wide. He is missed. May his neshama have an aliyah, and may we all be zocher to see Tchias HaMesim. You know the famous line from George Orwell's 1984, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. It sounds almost silly until you remember the world he's describing. In that world, even saying something obviously true might be forbidden. If the party says 2 + 2 is 5, then 5 it is, because what matters isn't truth, it's obedience. Orwell's hero, Winston Smith, works at the Ministry of Truth, where truth is whatever the people in power need it to be that day. Yesterday's facts become today's lies. Today's lies can become tomorrow's facts. The point isn't to persuade you. The point is to make everyone agree. Once you force people to agree on the answer, you own the question and you own them. We comfort ourselves. Relax, it's just a novel. Orwell was writing fiction, but the real world isn't like that. Really? Because when we open our phones and start scrolling, have you noticed how fast a fashionable opinion becomes the only opinion? Say 2 + 2 is 4, that's the correct answer, no? Not necessarily, because if X or TikTok has decided the answer is 5, well, guess what? You are the problem. Suddenly, sticking with something obvious feels uncomfortable, even dangerous. So the question is, why does this happen? How is it possible? Isn't truth objective? The answer is actually quite scary, and it has been proven by science. More than anything else, humans want to belong. We want to belong even more than we want to be right. In the 1950s, the psychologist Solomon Asch ran a simple experiment. 8 students sat in a row looking at 2 cards, one with a single line, the other with 3 lines labeled A, B, and C. The task was simple. Which one of the 3 matches the line on the card with the 1 line? Easy, right? But here's the twist. 7 out of the 8 students were actors. On certain rounds, they all gave the same obviously wrong answer, and the real student, the only one not in on the trick, had to answer last. What happened? About a third of the time, the real participant went along with the group. And this is really remarkable. Nearly 3/4 of non-actor participants caved into the majority at least once. 1 in 8 of them agreed with the group almost every time. Later, when the truth was revealed to the non-actor students, many of them admitted, I just went along with the majority. I thought maybe I was wrong, and they were right. After all, everyone agreed with the answer. How could they all be wrong? Asch concluded that even intelligent, decent people can be pushed into calling white black. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most revealing episodes in the entire Torah, the story of the Tower of Babel. In Parshas Noach, and here's the story. After the flood, humanity was still together, speaking Safa Achas Udvarim Achodim, one language and uniform words. They settled on the vast plain of Shinar and decided to build something impressive. Come, let us make bricks. Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth. It sounds like a great idea, right? Efficient, cooperative. They were organized. They spoke alike. They thought alike. They planned to build a city and a great monument. The fear that underscored all of this was, lest we scatter, let's stay together, let's be as one. But then the strangest thing happens. The Torah says God came down to see the city and the tower. God's response to this project was not thunder and fire. It's something quite different and quite unexpected. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, God says, so they will not all speak the same way. Suddenly, the builders can't understand each other. The great project stalls. People drift into different groups and different places and different cultures, speaking different languages, and the city is left behind. That's why it's called Babel, which means confusion, because God confused the language of the earth in that place and scattered people across the world. What were they doing that was so bad? What was wrong with their plan that generated this response from God? The classic commentators offer a few angles that fit together. Rashi hears arrogance and rebellion. This was a human attempt to storm heaven. But Ramban hears something else. He hears control. The fear of scattering becomes an excuse to build a single, centralized system that tolerates no differences. The Medrash actually says something chilling. If a brick fell and broke, they got upset. But if a worker fell and died, they would shrug and move on. The idea behind the Medrash is this, that when a project becomes sacred, then people become expendable. People become expendable. And that isn't unity, it's the worship of uniformity. So God intervenes not to destroy humanity, but to protect it. He doesn't smash the tower because he hates cooperation. He muddles the language because he loves human beings and wants them to succeed. God built diversity into the world so that no single idea, no single slogan, no single regime can ever lock up the human spirit and march us all together against good. After Babel, the world is not broken, it's decentralized. We still can work together. We still form families and nations and communities. But now there is a limit to how total any together can be. And you know what? That's a blessing. This will be the focus of our shir today. Yes, the Torah believes in unity. Shema Yisrael, one God, one people, one covenant. But the Torah rejects uniformity. God is not afraid of many voices. God loves both Hillel and Shammai, who can never agree, but they remain side by side. The world after Babel teaches us that unity is holy, but uniformity is dangerous. Our task is to build communities where we can stand together without thinking the same thoughts, where we can argue without becoming enemies, and where we can say calmly and kindly that 2 + 2 is still 4, even if you think it's 5. Let's dive a bit deeper into this. There's a reason thinking that 2 + 2 = 4 feels brave these days. We are social creatures. Survival is contingent on belonging. If the tribe doesn't like you, you don't last long. So our brains quietly whisper to us, agree first, think later. Over the past few years, with the world becoming a much smaller place, there is no room for difference. Nothing is more important than conforming to the majority, even if they're wrong. They must be right because so many of them are saying the same thing. And if anyone disagrees, they're bad because they are endangering the tribe. 3 forces pull us into uniformity. The first is belonging. Solomon Asch demonstrated that normal people conform to the crowd on questions as simple as judging line length. And if they'll do it for lines, they'll definitely do it for politics, religion, and identity. The second force is certainty. Complexity is exhausting. Certainty is much more comfortable. Slogans are easier to memorize than arguments are to evaluate. And then there is the third factor, risk. If saying what you think is right might cost you friends or job prospects or social standing, you won't just stay quiet. You'll internalize the majority view and make it yours to avoid that inner dissonance. Soon, we're not faking agreement, we're feeling it. Psychologists have a name for this, groupthink, the pressure to conform that shuts down dissent and does away with nuance. More seriously, it confuses loyalty with silence. Groupthink creates the illusion of unanimity because the people who disagree decide it's not worth the cost. How do you spot groupthink? The first way to spot it is to look out for self-censorship. The notion that I'll keep that to myself. Then there are the mind guards, the friend who says, don't bring that up here. And you also have sloganization, when complex issues are reduced to 3 or 4 words on a poster. Context is not essential. And finally, and this one is really dangerous, you have moral licensing, which says that because we're the good guys, whatever we do must be good. It's logical, right? We've all lived versions of this at work, in our communities, in families, online. But here's the thing. Uniformity flattens people. When a community is terrified of diversity, it gets dull at best and cruel at worst. And truth, that delicate plant, stops growing in soil that has been salted with fear. Let me tell you what the costs are. Bad decisions. If no one challenges the plan, the flaws survive the meeting. Stunted souls, people hide their God-given voice to keep the peace, and fragile unity. Uniformity looks strong until it cracks and then it shatters. So what's the alternative? I'll tell you. It's called unity. Not consensus at all costs, but a shared purpose that leaves room for honest difference. The orchestra model, many instruments playing different notes, but a symphony of different sounds that come together to form a beautiful tune. And guess what? Judaism actually expects disagreement. It's baked into the system. It's not a bug, it's a feature. A base medrash in a yeshiva sounds like thunder. Everyone shouting their version of the Gemara or Rashi or Tosfos or the Rambam. Because truth in Torah emerges from the friction of minds meeting, not the hush of minds mimicking. And this is where the Torah's wisdom is so startlingly modern. Long before social experiments and clever algorithms, the Torah warns us about the seduction of sameness, not in an academic paper, but in a story. A people with one language and uniform words building a perfect city with a perfect tower. The Torah tells us it's not perfect, it's not a dream, it's a nightmare. Now, let's move from the story to the theology. If the Tower of Babel story shows us what goes wrong when we absolutize sameness, the rest of the Torah shows us that what's right when we sanctify difference. If you start with the creation narrative, God doesn't create one thing over and over. He creates a world overflowing with different forms. He creates light and darkness. He creates land and sea. He creates fruit trees, leminehu, after their kinds. Lots of different types of fruit. The Torah's first outing is a feast of variety. Rav Hirsch points out that Jewish monotheism isn't threatened by diversity. On the contrary, it's expressed through diversity. God's oneness doesn't erase the many. Actually, it sustains the many. The unity of God we proclaim in Shema isn't only one permitted color. It is that every color belongs to Hashem. If God wanted uniformity, he could have given us tribe of Israel singular. Instead, he gives us 12 tribes, each with its own banner, its own derech, its own blessings, its own identity. That's not a concession to human weakness. It's a design feature. God seems to be saying, I want your unity, but I want it through your differences, not instead of your differences. This is why machlokes l'shem shamayim, disagreement for the sake of heaven, is holy. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos gives us the contrast. The disputes of Hillel and Shammai endure, the Mishnah tells us, but the dispute of Korach does not. Why? Because Hillel and Shammai were seeking the truth, not weaponizing it. They fought like scholars, but they lived like brothers. Korach was a destructive person. That kind of disagreement is the beginning of a full-on disaster. There's a Hasidic version of this that goes even deeper. The Ishbitzer Rebbe, the Mea Sheloach, teaches us that each soul carries a unique portion of divine service. A mitzvah performed by Reuven is not precisely the same as a mitzvah performed by Shimon, because the soul print differs. If you suppress individuality, you remove something of God's light from the world. It's such a beautiful idea. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks phrased it for the modern ear. God creates diversity. Humans create uniformity. The goal isn't to agree on everything. It's to bring our differences into a conversation under a shared covenant. If we were all the same, we'd have nothing to learn from one another. Think about language. God's choice to multiply languages at Babel wasn't random. Language is how a culture thinks. Different languages encode different nuances, different priorities, different metaphors. That complexity forces humility. You can't just shout louder, you must listen closer, because you'll always have something to learn from a person who is different from you. To be clear, the line between holy plurality and dangerous fracturing is a delicate one, which is why, in a moment, I'm going to talk about the prohibition of splitting society into two totally separate groups that have nothing in common. That is the polar opposite of the concept of Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, multiple truths spoken by the living God. The Torah assumes, God assumes, that we can live with tension. We can have strong convictions without crushing each other. God's oneness is so absolute that it can host our debates and disagreements without being threatened by them. From Mount Sinai onward, revelation is made up of finite words that contain infinite pathways. Chazal say, Shivim ponim la Torah, there are 70 faces to Torah. And by the way, 70 isn't a cap. If there's more than 70, that's fine too. The Torah expects you to find fresh angles, so long as you remain within the covenantal frame. That's the key. Be different, that's fine, but don't be defiant. Don't be a destructive contrarian. So when we ask, why did God confuse the languages? The theological answer is this: to prevent the worship of consensus and to cultivate the holiness of conversation. God wants a world that seeks to find him from many directions, from every direction, because each direction adds a truth that the others cannot generate on their own. That's why the Jewish people can be so diverse and yet remain so united. When we reduce a community to one single monotonous tone, we get purity, perhaps, but it is at the cost of life-giving oxygen. But when we honor many tones under one Shema, we get true harmony. We've painted the ideal. Now, tachlis. How does Torah legislate unity without uniformity? The Halakhic system builds two guardrails. First, we have lo tiskoidedu, no schisms that destroy what we have in common. But then we have the beautiful concept of Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. We legitimate plurality and different approaches, as long as they allow us to remain under one roof. The Rambam codifies Jewish authority structures. A central Sanhedrin is necessary to prevent total fragmentation, but local Batei Din follow the received Masorah and remain relatively autonomous. When in doubt, they decide based on their local traditions. But the key thing is, don't fracture the people. Unity isn't about everyone being identical. It's a functional system that keeps Torah one while allowing people and groups who stay loyal to Torah some sense of individuality. Chazal ask, why was it decided that the halacha followed the opinion of Beis Hillel in all but 18 disagreements they had with Beit Shammai? Chazal tell us because they were humble. Beis Hillel was humble. They always taught Beis Shammai's position first. Judaism, as a matter of principle, privileges the voice that can hear another voice. Elu ve'elu says multiple true pathways can live under one Torah, provided they're argued l'shem shamayim and anchored in Masorah. And the clincher is this: even with deep Halakhic disputes, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai still intermarried. The Gemara in Yevamos tells us they trusted each other's kashrus and familial status. That's the Halakhic culture we aspire to. We love a fierce debate as long as it is around a shared table. Now let's bring this back to the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel principle is simple: one plan, one rule, and no dissent, and if necessary, sacrifice people to preserve the project. Elu v'elu says, Judaism says, there are many paths to the one God. Lo tiskoidadu says, don't turn many paths into many peoples. And this is our modern faith aspiration. Contemporary culture tells us if we disagree, we're enemies. The Torah answers, if we disagree within covenant, we're family. Elu v'elu demands intellectual generosity. Lo tiskoidadu demands communal responsibility. The tightrope is real, and at times it's scary, but the promise is beautiful. One God, one Torah, one people, and many gates. We aren't asked to march in verbal unison. We're asked to walk together, arguing toward heaven and avoiding factional drama down here on earth. So what does this look like in life? Let me show you. 2 brief, authentic vignettes that embody principled disagreement without rupture, unity without uniformity. One of the best-known rabbinic disputes of the last 100 years is the one between Rav Kook and Rav Yosef Chaim Zonenfeld. Rav Zonenfeld was the spiritual leader of the Yishuv HaYoshon, the established Orthodox community in Jerusalem. He was deeply respected in Eretz Yisrael and around the world for his complete loyalty to the traditional way the community had been organized and run by his predecessors, and in particular for his refusal to cooperate with the Zionists, both secular and religious, who he saw as an affront to tradition and as a danger to the purity of the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Kook, who initially came to Eretz Yisrael in 1905 as the Rabbi of Jaffa, which was somewhat off the beaten track, was a visionary spiritual leader who was poles apart from Rav Zonenfeld, although he was not a political Zionist, or a member of any Zionist group actually. Rav Kook believed that the project to bring Jews back to Eretz Yisrael, the biblical land of Israel, had messianic overtones that he welcomed, and he believed that the secular Jews behind the efforts to create a Jewish state were doing God's holy work, even if they didn't see it that way themselves. In 1920, Rav Kook was appointed chief rabbi of the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael, a position recognized by the British authorities. He utilized his position to promote the ideas of Jewish statehood in Eretz Yisrael far and wide. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in bitter conflicts with the Yishuv HaYoshon and its leader, Rav Yosef Chaim Zonenfeld. And yet, the human fabric held. Rav Kook and Rav Zonenfeld were respectful and cordial to each other whenever they met in person, despite their fierce disagreements. In fact, the record shows genuine warmth beneath the headlines. The two rabbis appeared together at events, signed proclamations on matters they agreed on, and were even photographed together on several occasions. A careful survey in the journal Chakirah cites more than 10 joint proclamations and many pictures of the two side by side, including a well-known image from the 1930s, at the height of their dispute over advancing Zionist activities. Letters and published memoirs from eyewitnesses describe moments where they showed each other honor at events. At a Pidyon Haben, for example, where Rav Kook was the designated Kohen, he sat at the head table alongside Rav Zonenfeld. And that event, when Rav Kook led Birkas Hamazon, the benching, and a few drops of wine spilt from the cup, Rav Zonenfeld quickly placed his hand beneath Rav Kook's hand that was holding the cup of wine to receive the drops. On another occasion, Rav Kook saw Rav Zonenfeld standing and rose to bring him a chair, saying simply, "He is elderly and a rabbi, we must honor him." And when Rav Zonenfeld passed away, Rav Kook reportedly wanted to attend the funeral, but was dissuaded by his son out of concern for zealot violence, which shows his intention, Rav Kook's intention, to show respect to someone with whom he had bitterly disagreed. Taken together, these details demonstrate our theme in this shir: unity without uniformity. The machlokas between Rav Kook and Rav Zonenfeld was sharp. Their policies on how to conduct Jewish affairs in Eretz Yisrael were very far apart, but their personal conduct modelled elu va'elu, along with lo diskoidedu, principled disagreement held within a single people, keeping kavod and dignity intact. And here is another example of finding a way to stay together rather than creating a festering division. In the raw, complicated early years of the State of Israel, the Haredi world was small, very poor, and still reeling from the Holocaust. The undisputed rabbinic heavyweight of the Haredi community was a man called the Chazon Ish, a physically small, soft-spoken scholar who held no official post yet somehow radiated authority from a modest, book-lined apartment in Bnei Brak. On the other side of the spectrum was David Ben-Gurion, the tough founder of the Zionist-inspired country, a very secular Jew with a visionary's impatience, who was determined to sculpt a modern Jewish state out of dust and dreams. If you were writing a Hollywood screenplay, you'd keep those two men in totally separate worlds and let the tension simmer. But Israel and the Jewish people aren't a screenplay. And if you know anything about Jewish history, you'll know that it has a habit of forcing unlikely people into the same small room. So, in October 1952, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion visited the Chazon Ish in Bnei Brak. There was no entourage, no press, just the Prime Minister, his young secretary, Yitzhak Navon, and an elderly Gadol Hador, whose furniture was as modest as his manner. Ben-Gurion's diary entry for the meeting is unusually tender. He describes the Chazon Ish's spiritual face, his gracious temperament, and a conversation that was held, quote, in a good spirit and with much laughter, unquote, notably, quote, lacking in a zealot's anger, unquote. That line matters. The country was in the throes of arguments about everything: conscription, national service for religious girls, the texture of public Shabbat, and who gets to define who's Jewish. And yet, in that room, the tone was curiosity, not combative. Two people searching for common ground more than trying to score points. They spoke in Hebrew, even though they both could speak fluent Yiddish. They covered matters ranging from principle to policy, and they really tried, to imagine a way for two very different Israels to live as one. What came out of the meeting wasn't a grand peace treaty. It was something more Jewish, a living status quo. Always a bit messy, but it was real. The Chazon Ish never endorsed Zionist ideology, but he urged his followers to engage with the state's civic framework because that was the reality in which Am Yisrael now lived. And David Ben-Gurion, he didn't become an observant Orthodox Jew, but he recognized that the spiritual burden carried by the Torah world was not a museum piece. It was a living, breathing, essential part of the Jewish nation. Between them, they helped sketch a modus vivendi that kept the Jewish family at one table, however awkward the seating chart might have been and still remains. And that's precisely our theme. Nobody surrendered their principles. Nobody burned the other one down to look good on the front page. Two leaders with utterly different maps of the Jewish future and utterly different constituencies met with decency and dignity, argued with conviction, and then kept walking on the same road, just about together enough to keep the nation whole and the country together. That's what we mean when we say unity without uniformity. It's the grown-up Jewish art of staying in conversation when agreement is not on offer. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks loved using the orchestra image, and it's perfect here. If everyone plays a different tune on the same instrument, you don't get harmony, you get a lot of noise. But give each musician a part, even on completely different instruments, each with its own tone and timing, but playing from a carefully calibrated score, and suddenly the differences make music. That, Rabbi Sachs said, is the Jewish people. We are not meant to sound identical, but we are meant to play from the same score. The score is Torah and Jewish tradition. The conductor is God, and the orchestra is a very mixed ensemble. 12 tribes, many communities, Hillel and Shammai, Sephardim and Ashkenazim, Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, Zionists and non-Zionists, all of us, wherever we are and whatever floats our boat. God's oneness doesn't erase our manyness. On the contrary, it makes our manyness even more possible, because when we keep our eye on the conductor and our place in the score, the result isn't cacophony, it's a symphony. Let's tie these vignettes back to our theme. The Babel of Parshas Noach weaponized uniformity and was willing to sacrifice humans to save the plan. The Torah does the opposite. It protects humans and lets plans evolve. Our task isn't to pretend differences don't matter. Of course they matter. And we have every right to insist on our version, even if someone disagrees. But we must learn and internalize the idea that those who think and act differently from us, but still want to be a part of the family, must never be shunned or dismissed. We can make it all work as long as we stay together. Which brings me, finally, to a voice that embodies this balance with uncommon grace. This week, someone shared a transcription on Facebook of a talk given by Rav Lichtenstein. Rav Lichtenstein, the Rosh Hashiva of Gush, son-in-law of Rav J.B. Soloveitchik, but who, before he went to YU, had studied in Haredi yeshivas, and so was familiar with a world beyond the world he made his own. This piece was posted by Tzvi Sinensky on Facebook, and it is based on a Hebrew post by Rav Menachem Bombach. It recalls a closed, personal conversation between a group of Haredi University students and Rav Lichtenstein that totally captures our whole shir. Elu ve'elu without fear, lo tisgodedu without fracture, and most importantly, a humility that doesn't clamour for unanimity. The first section contains Rav Bombach's brief recollection, followed by the translation of his notes of Rav Lichtenstein's remarks. Just a couple of words about Rav Bombach. He grew up in Meir Sharim, at the heart of the anti-Zionist community based there, and received a classic Haredi education before going on to obtain a BA in education and an MA in public policy at Hebrew University, a truly remarkable journey. In 2013, Rav Bombach founded Hamidrasha HaChasidit, a Hasidic high school in Israel that combines rigorous Torah learning with comprehensive preparation for Israel's matriculation exams. He has also established elementary and high schools in Jerusalem, Beit Shemesh, under the Netzach educational network, which today encompasses 10 schools. In short, he is an anomaly and a pioneer, an incredible person. Anyway, this is what he wrote to introduce Rav Lichtenstein's words. For years, I've carried with me the encounter I had with Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. He came to speak with us, a group of Haredi students at the university, in a closed, personal conversation. Today, I met one of his students, and it brought me back to those incredible moments. I've been wondering since then, if the rabbi was speaking with us today, after October 7th, what would he say? He would ask us to keep an open heart, to hold a faith unafraid of the world, and to maintain moral responsibility precisely in a time of crisis. And here are the main points of what he said to us, published here for the first time. This is on Facebook, you can look it up. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My first visit to Israel was when I was 30, while my wife was pregnant, for which I received a rebuke from Rav Hutner. We crisscrossed the country, visiting the centers of Torah. Among those with whom I formed a friendship was Rebbetzin Landau, the wife of the Rav of Bnei Brak. I arrived in Bnei Brak on a scorching hot day. I went in to see Rabbi Landau, and he said to me, "You come on a hot day. Do me a favor and take off your jacket." In Haredi society, there are distinct ranks, including those with short sleeves and those with long sleeves, among others. I went to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in short sleeves, and likewise to Rebel Soloveitchik, and I realized they saw me as an American who didn't know the rules of the game. For years, I've been answering questions and engaging in dialogue at gatherings. I try to do the best I can, but clearly, this is only me. A person must continue to live by the truth of Torah, including appreciation for those who dwell in the world of Torah, into old age. On the other hand, I did not grow up in an environment that sanctified old age. The questions you raise deal with the encounter between two worlds. In yeshiva, there are primary and secondary questions. A secondary question is one that need not arise in studying a sugya. There are also essential questions. Understanding the Gemara through intellectual, scientific, philosophical, or some other effort. The question of authority is very significant. The word of God is expressed through halakha, prophecy, and more. But don't turn the structure of authority into an iron wall. It's impossible to treat all questions uniformly. On every issue, there are divergent opinions dating back to the days of Chazal. Regarding the Haredi community, I fear that even this simple truth cannot be voiced. A community so steeped in dispute and debate, my mother used to say that she remembers from tells that if someone didn't know how to learn, they would say, it's a machloikus. The sugya of the rebellious elder, the Zokin Mamre, says, so that there not be division in Israel. When there is a gap between views, many poskim, the Rishonim, prefer to minimize the gap. Among us, it's the opposite, especially in Brisk, and I share that tendency. After being trained in yeshiva, one finds machloikas between Rishonim even when there are only slight nuances. That's my profession, to look for them. But we must understand both the historical truth and their epistemological truth. Must we always accept a vast gulf between positions? When it's not a Halakhic issue, but an ideological one, suddenly there's total unanimity. And if someone voices a slightly different view, he's treated harshly. If he even brings a proof from a tshuva of the Rashba, oi! Two questions then. Did everyone truly always agree on matters of belief? Why this craving for uniformity? Why would those accustomed to a culture of Halakhic disagreement demand unanimity in thought? If in halacha machloikas is enriching and illuminating, why in matters of values must there be no machloikas? If there are differing medrashim, people dismiss them as, it's just medrash. But maybe they represent distinct worldviews, ideals, or philosophies. A chassid once said to a misnagid, among us there's a gartel between the heart and the loins. Among you, the misnagdim, it's between the mouth and the heart. So there is no single answer. Not everyone who holds an unconventional opinion becomes a heretic or an apostate. That should not be our atmosphere. And another point. It troubles me that people can sit around a table. King Arthur's table was round, without head or foot. During the Vietnam War, two politicians sat for months deciding on the shape of the table they would sit at for the peace conference. We need at least a willingness to hear another voice, even that of someone you haven't vetted. Everything I've said for the last few minutes, those are the words of Rav Lichtenstein, as quoted by Rav Bombach. It is expressive of this idea of Elu ve'elu, lived with courage, and Lo Tiskoidedu, lived with compassion. Rav Lichtenstein is telling us that God scattered Babel so that no human project could ever march the whole world against heaven again. That only happens if no one is allowed to have a different language, a different voice, a different viewpoint. Our task is to argue like Hillel and Shammai, and to love each other like family. May the Ribono Shel Olam help us turn our differences into harmony, and our harmony into Kiddush Hashem. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.